Hi, this is Don Forsyth speaking to you of groups and group dynamics. In my previous presentation, dealing with conflict, the roots of disagreement, discord, friction that occurs oftentimes within groups, we identified 5 basic sources of conflict, which moves the group from routine interaction to disagreement to full-fledged conflict, which escalates up before it can then de-escalate. And that includes competition over scarce resources, failure, or disagreements about how resources should be shared equitably or equally, uh, controlling factors within the group of who's in charge, who's leading, who's following. Often, in many cases, groups develop a hierarchy so that some individuals are more influential than others. And oftentimes there's a benefit associated with being higher up in the hierarchy rather than lower down, and that can lead to conflict. In many cases as well, group members find themselves in conflict because they simply disagree. It could be in what's sometimes termed an honest disagreement about some aspect of the work or decision to be made. And that kind of conflict is completely appropriate if well managed and if it contributes to the overall effectiveness of the group. Unfortunately, in many cases, it spills over into interpersonal conflict, so that people who disagree with each other about work-related matters come to actually dislike each other as well. Moving from those causes of conflict, I want to talk very briefly in this presentation about factors that can cause conflict to escalate, and also ways the group members can intervene and reduce conflict within the group. Factors which can escalate conflict include uncertainty, changes in perceptions and soft tactics to shifting to hard tactics, movement from reciprocity and fairness to retaliation, emotional factors, where irritation with another person during conflict can cause anger, and also the tendency for group conflicts to enlarge and to draw more people into the fray, so that conflict between two people can cause conflict within the entire group. As always in our analysis, I'll only hit the high points. There's far more detail presented about these processes in Chapter 13 of the book, Group Dynamics. But to look first at how uncertainty is often replaced by a tendency to become more committed to a position. In some cases, people will go into a meeting thinking they favor option A rather than option B, and when they realize that others disagree with them in favor of option B, they become rigidly committed to option A, even though they were very uncertain that that was the right choice prior to the meeting. Jack Brem's concept of reactance explains this. Reactance is the tendency for individuals to react negatively to the feeling that their freedom has been threatened. So if an individual during a group meeting says, let's consider option B, I generally prefer it, reactance doesn't occur. But if that same person says, option B is clearly the best choice, I can't imagine anyone disagreeing with me that B is the correct choice, reactance is likely to occur, and we will tend to feel ourselves wishing to reject option B and in fact favor option A. Misperception is also the rule rather than the exception during group conflict. In most cases, we are very accurate perceivers of others' motivation, their personality, their emotional states, but during conflict, our perceptions can often be distorted. And as a result, misattribution occurs. We attribute others' actions to the incorrect causes. Oftentimes this results in the fundamental attribution error, or FAE. And that's when we attribute behaviors which are caused by the situation. So for example, a colleague is disagreeing with us simply because he's trying to find the best solution, reach a good decision within the group. A colleague is disagreeing with us because that's what they're supposed to do. They or they realize that a group can make the best decision if the individual plays the devil's advocate and brings diverse opinions within the group. But we don't attribute that person's behavior to the situational factors. Instead, we assume it's something about them personally. Perhaps they're a person who's hostile towards us. Perhaps they don't like us. We attribute their action to personal qualities of the individual, failing to recognize how influential the situation is in producing their behavior. And as a result, we often misunderstand their motivations. Researchers have shown that it's often the case that we are accurate perceivers of others' competitive motivations, but frequently misunderstand when others are acting in ways which are cooperative and will actually benefit us. During conflict, as well as individuals try to work with one another and try to achieve their own goals and perhaps persuade others to take their viewpoint, the soft tactics that they use escalate into hard tactics. So rather than explaining, please do this, we end up poking each other in the interpersonal eye. Dean Pruitt and his colleagues demonstrated this effect very nicely in a study where group members were to cooperate on a joint task. There was a confederate in the group that tended to not share things such as the glue or the stapler or other materials with the rest of the group members. Initially, the group members very politely requested the glue and made clear statements such as, "We need the glue," escalating into demands and complaints until eventually they used harder tactics such as insulting the other individual, threatening the other person with harm perhaps, or even describing the person with negative terms, abuse, if you will. So the soft tactics that are typically used, such as persuasion, bargaining, gave way to threats, promises of punishment, and harm being done to another person. These processes, this shift from soft tactics to hard tactics, were also illustrated by Deutsch and Krauss in their classic trucking game experiment. Using a method similar to a prisoner's dilemma game, two individuals played this competitive game. Could have been a cooperative game, but in fact it became quickly a competitive game. They role-played the owners of two trucking companies, Acme and Bolt. They could take their materials to their destination either using this roundabout route, or they could use the more direct route. Unfortunately, they had to share this one-lane road, so that if Bolt wanted to pass, he had to stay here and wait for Acme to pass. They could have shared that. They could have cooperated, first Acme letting Bolt go first, and then Bolt letting Acme go first. But they could do that unless they had the capacity to threaten each other. And threats were created by Deutsch and Krauss by giving control over gates to Acme and to Bolt. If just one of the players controlled a gate, so Bolt, for example, could control this gate, but Acme had no gate, both groups, both players, learned how to deal with this situation effectively, and both usually profited. However, when both controlled gates, in other words, their capacity to threaten was equal, that's when you found the groups were unable to do anything except for compete, and cooperation was lost totally. Even giving people the opportunity to communicate back and forth about the situation didn't really help resolve the conflict, as illustrated in this case.
Again, the first move is to use the weapon. And they do communicate.
Say, your gate is closed.
I know it's closed.
Well, that's not very fair.
Well, it is if I can win.
Well, I'm going to close mine then, too.
On that trial, Acme lost 46 cents and Bolt lost 51 cents.
The Deutsch and Krauss experiment very clearly illustrates what happens when both parties can threaten each other. They will use those threats, and as a result, conflict escalates. Also, Deutsch and Krauss demonstrated that allowing people to communicate with each other did not help them resolve their conflict. They used communication, in fact, to increase their threat levels rather than resolve the conflict. Other factors which create escalations in conflict include the tendency for reciprocity to give way to retaliation. So the norm of reciprocity supports, of course, the golden rule, which is if someone benefits us, so we should certainly benefit them as well. But it also suggests the norm of reciprocity that others harm us, then we may harm them back. It suggests that retaliation is appropriate in conflict situations. And that will only lead to conflict resolution over time. It's particularly complicated by the tendency to overmatch, and that is that individuals don't return in kind what they receive. So that, for example, if a person experiences some harm, they may feel they're able to retaliate and also return the harm, but their harm is usually greater than what they received, and as a result, conflicts escalate. Also, conflict generally is irritating. It means that the group members aren't able to achieve the goals that they're striving to, that they're working towards. It could be their own individual goals are thwarted. It could be that the group is now unsuccessful. It's not able to achieve its goal, and as a result, that irritation can give way to anger in many circumstances. So the expression of a strong emotion, and that can, of course, lead to a number of negative interpersonal processes. People generally do not like to be on the receiving end of angry emotions, and that can trigger angry emotions in response. And if violence is likely to occur in a group, it's usually preceded by angry expressions. One of the positive things about online groups, of course, is that the group members are physically separated from each other, interacting only via computers. But oftentimes they can use those computers to send very negative emotional messages to each other. The worry was that this kind of negative emotional expression would become rampant, and the concept of flaming was invoked, the idea that people send hostile messages. And although it's true in online communities, trolls, for example, are often known to post negative messages in discussion forums. The expression of negative emotions is actually relatively rare in online groups, particularly groups that have standards for how to communicate. So, for example, Wikipedia is created by a community of authors who research topics and post information on Wikipedia and try to clarify and expand entries. And often they enter into very heated conflicts about the accuracy of the information they're presenting in Wikipedia. However, the community is very closely regulated, and expressions of anger, inappropriate anger, will result in an individual being removed from the community. Another factor which can cause conflict to escalate, to grow stronger before it grows weaker, is the tendency for other group members to be drawn into the fray. So initially, two people in the group may find themselves in disagreement, but oftentimes they ask others to join their side in the disagreement, and as a result, coalitions form. And the conflict, which was once localized, involved just two individuals, and therefore was an intra-group conflict, in fact becomes an intergroup conflict. And as our next chapter will reveal, intergroup conflicts tend to be more robust, tend to be stronger, more intense, and more difficult to resolve than conflicts between two individuals. As we have seen, conflict tends to escalate as a result of all of these processes. But also conflict can be managed and perhaps even ideally be resolved by reversing these processes. So rather than move towards certainty, negotiate who's right and who is wrong, correct misperceptions, generate understanding, abandon hard tactics, and shift back to more cooperative tactics, and so on. I'll examine those briefly, if you will. Negotiation. Fisher and Urey's classic analysis, Getting to Yes. It's a wonderful book talking about how to deal with conflict situations and how to reverse commitment and instead reach towards situations, solutions that can benefit both sides. They contrast soft negotiation and hard negotiation. Soft negotiation is simply giving in to others' requests. Hard negotiation is refusing to give in and view the situation as a win-loss situation where I must win and you must lose. They instead recommend principled negotiation, where group members work together amicably to find a solution to the problem that benefits everyone. Analyses of empathy, being able to recognize other people's perceptions and understanding, suggests that we have, and most primates have, a great capacity to understand others' emotions and experiences. Mirror neurons, for example, have been identified, which are active during the process of empathy and lets us understand other people's motivations and emotions. And empathy, even both forms in terms of cognitive and emotional recognition, can result in reductions in conflict. So we are wired, basically, at the biological level to reduce our conflicts rather than escalate them. Dean Pruitt's dual concern model of conflict identifies the 5 basic approaches to conflict, and although all 5 are frequent ways to deal with conflict, cooperative approaches are usually best for reducing conflict so that all sides benefit. His model is it's a 2x2 analysis based on these 2 dimensions: high concern for self, low concern for self, versus concern for others, which can be high and low. So if you look at the extremes along these 2 dimensions, you see the 4 basic types. If you don't care about other people's outcomes and only care about your own, you fight. If you're very concerned with others' outcomes and your own, you cooperate. If you're mostly concerned with others' outcomes and don't really worry about your own, you yield. And if you're not really concerned with others' outcomes or your own outcomes, you simply avoid conflict altogether. Conciliation can be found at the center of these 2 dimensions. Other conflict resolution mechanisms: the process of abandoning retaliation and opting for forgiveness, recognizing what the other person's choices involve. If they have harmed you, not attempt to harm them in return, but seek an understanding of why they may have harmed you and forgive them for having done so. Studies of the prisoner's dilemma game have identified a particular strategy effective in these kinds of competitive circumstances, which is called tit for tat. When others cooperate with you, cooperate in return. If others compete, then compete as well. Do not compete at a more excessive level than they have competed. Instead, respond directly to competition. And if they should cooperate, immediately respond to their cooperative gesture with cooperation as well. Tit for tat is described as a nice, provocable, clear, and forgiving approach to dealing with conflict. Another way to deal with conflict is to reduce the number of people involved in the conflict. So do not allow other group members to be drawn into the fray. Isolate it as much as possible. And perhaps even turn to a third party to help mediate the conflict. That third party might be able to make decisions on his or her own, in which case it would be an inquisitorial mediation process. They can engage in arbitration, where both sides have to agree to the outcome. But in any case, you may even leave the group and have someone outside of the group intervene to resolve the conflict. Sometimes just time is needed as well to reduce the negative emotions that conflict can create. The old recommendation to count to 10 before you respond is an excellent one. The group, perhaps, if the discussion becomes particularly heated, should simply adjourn so that the next session cooler heads can prevail. This is the same bit of advice that recommends not sending that angry email until you've had a chance to reread it after you've cooled down a bit. One continuing controversy in the analysis of conflict and its reduction within small groups is whether or not conflict is, well, inescapable within a group, and possibly on a more positive note, if it's beneficial for a group. Studies of group development, for example, suggest that groups need to move through a conflict stage and learn how to deal with disagreement effectively before it can become a fully functioning group, a highly cohesive group. Research is still not clear that conflict of any type is beneficial. DeDrew and his colleagues have found through meta-analytic work that in most cases, even task conflict, which is part of the group's process and should help the group work more effectively in the future and to make superior decisions, even task conflict tends to undermine group functioning. However, the key seems to be the effectiveness with which the group can manage its conflicts. So when disagreements arise, discord, friction occurs within the group, which is practically inevitable. If the group recognizes these sources of conflicts and deals with them rationally, effectively, immediately, and in a positive way, then the conflict will not have negative consequences. Most groups, however, are not able to manage their conflict effectively, and so conflict tends to have a negative impact on groups and their dynamics. In my next presentation, I'll move from conflict within a group, intra-group conflict, to the analysis of conflict between groups, intergroup conflict, and we'll use as the case to examine that process the sheriff's famous study at the Robber's Cave. As always, thank you for joining me in this analysis of groups and their dynamics.